If you're like me, you're probably always tempted to carry too many cameras and too many lenses. But the question is, how many is the right amount to carry? Have you heard the phrase one camera, one lens? Many people say one camera, one lens will make you a better photographer. Do I agree? No, I don't agree. Maybe partly agree. Let me explain. So yes, in this video we're going to talk about whether you can benefit from only using one camera and one lens. It obviously doesn't need to be this camera, and we'll talk about different cameras and different lenses. Pros and cons of using only one camera, pros and cons of using only one lens. I'll cover 7 possible solutions which may give you the best of both worlds, and 2 recent examples from my own photography. Let's get started. Okay, what about the argument of only using one lens on your camera? Here are my 5 pros for only using one lens. If you think of any I missed, let me know in the comments below. It'd be good to hear them. If you stay with me until the end of the video, I'll include the results from my recent YouTube poll on which is your favorite focal length if you could only use one lens. Okay, benefit number 1. If you master one lens, you can pre-visualize that focal length. This is what most of the famous kind of street photographers used to do of yesteryear. They were used to using, for example, 50mm lenses. And so then they didn't even need to bring the camera to their face. They knew that here to here in the street was 50mm, and then they just go bang, take the shot. Pre-visualizing your scene by using only one lens is really useful if you want to work quickly. Benefit number 2, the same as we said with the camera, only using one lens will give you a consistent look. This can be broken down into different lens manufacturers will have a different maybe 3D pop, or they'll have different colors. Say some lenses are warmer, some lenses are cooler, but mainly the focal length. If you're using different focal lengths, each focal length will give you a different look. I can bring up a series of portraits and you can see these are portraits at 28mm. These are portraits at 35mm, portraits at 50mm, portrait at 90mm, portrait at 135mm, and for completeness at 200mm. As you can see, the face dimensions change with every focal length. So if you're trying to produce a consistent body of work, it's important to try to stick to one focal length to give all your images the same kind of overall look. Number 3, by only using one lens, you're going to save a lot of time. This can be broken down into 2 parts. Part number 1, you're going to save a huge amount of time when it comes to packing for your photography day or trip. If you're like me, you probably spend 3 times longer trying to select the lens for your trip than actually the clothes, for example, you take with you. So number 1, you're going to save time packing. Number 2, you're going to save time on location. You're not going to be faffing around digging into your bag. Oh, do I need 35mm? Swap. Oh no, do I need 50mm? Swap. Do I need 90mm? Bonus tip, if you're like an M user, you can pre-visualize which focal length you may want to use by using the frame selector switch. So if you look to the viewfinder and move the selector switch, you'll see the frame change. Then you can see if you see the world through, say, a 28mm view, 35mm view, 50mm view, 90mm view, etc. It's quite useful because you don't need to attach the lens to pre-visualize what you're looking at. If you've only got one lens, less faffing, much faster, and you get your shots without wasting so much time. Benefit number 4, you're going to have less kit to carry. Goes without saying. If you've only got one camera, one lens that fits maybe in a big pocket, if you're using, say, like a 3 camera with maybe a 50mm 3.5 Elmar attached. If you're only carrying one lens, you don't need a massive rucksack full of spare lenses. So that always makes it a lot easier for carrying stuff around. And number 5, another benefit of only one lens, it's going to save you a lot less money. You could buy one really nice lens instead of having to buy one really nice lens in each focal length. Benefit number 6, I'm looking at a lot of these pros and cons based on my own personal work, and that usually means client work, either models or weddings or maybe limited time on vacation. But what about for everybody else that just shoots for fun? If you have all the time in the world, then using only one lens can be brilliant because you can visit the same location, let's say 3 times for argument's sake. You could visit once with a 28mm lens or 21mm lens, maybe a better example, and shoot really wide scenes. You could visit once with a 50mm lens and shoot more normal view compositions. And then you could visit with, say, I don't know, 135mm. So that gives you 3 days out to the same location, and each time you'll see the world completely differently. You could even go 4 times and take a macro lens on the 4th trip and then do really close-up work and kind of get to appreciate the things at a much more macro detail level. So when time is not a limit, one lens is a great benefit, I think, because you get to appreciate the same location multiple times. I keep thinking of additional benefits. Benefit number 7, if you're kind of a bit stuck with your photography at the moment and you can't feel excited to go out, just by buying a new lens will get you excited with your photography again and will make you go out and make you start using your camera. One new lens will maybe reignite your love for photography, so don't underestimate the power of one lens. And with that said, benefit number 8 of one lens: if you're, say, newish to photography and you've only ever used autofocus cameras and autofocus lenses, and if you're using a modern camera with a modern lens with no aperture scale and manual focus options on the lens itself, just by treating yourself to one vintage lens from eBay will again quite possibly transform your photography for the better. I taught myself photography with a Panasonic Micro Four Thirds camera, and those cameras come with autofocus lenses. When I then treated myself to a manual focus Voigtlander Ultron 40mm f1.4 lens, that is when my photography basically started. I learned f-stops, aperture, manual focus, manual settings, and life just got good from then. So my best tip for anybody that doesn't own a manual focus lens: treat yourself to a £50 vintage lens from eBay, and that may be the start of photography proper for you, because you appreciate and learn things so much faster if you're shooting in manual and with a vintage lens with manual settings. The problem with many of the modern lenses is now you have no aperture scale, no manual focus ring, and they're kind of focused by wire, so they're not particularly useful for teaching yourself photography and for getting the maximum enjoyment from your camera, I think. Okay, but with all those benefits, what are the cons of only using one lens? Problem number 1 is a massive problem. Talking from experience, I was out this morning and it caused me a lot of upset and frustration. The problem is, if you only carry one lens, you will miss photos 100%. It doesn't matter what people say in terms of you're going to become a better photographer because you can zoom with your feet. Yes, it's true that we can zoom with our feet, but as you move, you change the perspective, meaning you're not going to get the photo that you want to take with the composition that you have in mind. And you can get better with working within restrictions of only being able to use a particular focal length. Personally, I think that's a bit of BS. It just means you're going to miss photos. It depends on how you're shooting. Yes, it's great to work within restrictions if you're trying to be creative, but what I mean is, if you're only visiting one location once and you've only got a set amount of time, and time is important, then working within restrictions isn't particularly useful. As a great example, I was in Tenerife when making this video and I had a limited time to get the photos I'd like to take. When I then visited the location with the one lens to kind of work within my restrictions, I found that the lenses were not the correct lenses for what I was seeing. So I went back the next day, but the weather had already changed and I'd missed my opportunity. I'm now back in England in my warm clothes, so I missed the photos. So you do need to be a bit selective on when you decide to use restrictions, if the final photo is important to you and if you are working within time restrictions especially. For example, zooming with your feet. If you're on the edge of the cliff and if you want to step back to get a wider perspective, you're going to fall off the cliff. Number 2, if you're in a narrow street and you're trying to back up to get a wider view of the street, again, you can't back up because you've already got your back against the wall and that's as far back as you can go. Okay, maybe an extreme example with the cliff scenario, but perhaps something more easy to visualize. If you're working indoors in confined spaces, such is often the case for, say, wedding photography, you need to make sure you carry a wide lens because you're going to miss so many photos. Even if you visit the venue beforehand and you can visualize the venue, for the bridal prep shots and the getting ready shots, they might be in a small hotel room. So if you'd only plan to use a 50mm lens because it's a big open outdoor wedding, when they're actually getting ready, you'll miss your shots. That's 2 great examples of when you don't have a wide enough lens. Equally, well, if you don't have a long enough lens, you've got some amazing structure in the distance, but you can't physically get there because there's a private garden between you and the thing you're trying to photograph. Or there's a massive crevasse, or there's a highway, or there's something between you and the subject, meaning you cannot get close enough to give the subject any impact in your final photo. Again, there's a wedding example. Sometimes you can't get close enough to the action for speeches, so long lenses are useful for that. And another situation where I've appreciated long lenses is on a cycling trip in the Canary Islands. Everything just seemed so far away, so I just couldn't get any impact from like a wide lens or a normal lens. Or for example, you're trying to create compression and you don't have a long enough lens to create the compression. Again, you're going to miss the photo that you're trying to create. And I've not finished, there are more problems. You could be shooting with a f2.8 lens and you find there's not enough daylight to be able to shoot at f2.8 with the film stock you're using, or you've maxed out your high ISO. High ISO is probably less of a problem because the current cameras go to ISO 1 million. But for those of you familiar with the Leica M9, it didn't have a great high ISO, and that's the reason I bought my 50mm f1 Noctilux,
because for UK weddings when we were not allowed flash, I needed the f1 to get my shots.
But for film especially, if you have a lens that isn't fast enough, again you're going to miss your photos if the light levels are not sufficient. And lastly, a problem close to my heart is often a rangefinder guy. If your minimum focus distance of your lens is not close enough to be able to photograph the subject you're trying to photograph, it's going to cause you frustration. So as someone who enjoys the vintage Leica lenses and vintage rangefinder lenses, one problem you will have is you cannot focus closer than 1 meter. So if you then try and do a close-up of a butterfly photo, you're going to miss your shot because you cannot focus closer than 1 meter.
Sorry, not a very useful example. I'm sure any rangefinder camera user will know they're not best suited to close-up photography. I found the 35mm LTM lenses with the close focus distance of 1 meter just not close enough for my portraits, and even 50mm LTM lenses often give me a similar restriction. For that reason, I now use the 7 Artisans close focus adapter on the SL and CL cameras.
Okay, and all that was only point number 1. Number 2, FOMO, fear of missing out. By only having one lens, you're going to miss photos. So it's not only the actual physically missing the photos, it's the fear that you know you're going to miss the photos because you bought the wrong kit. And number 3, more specific, if you specialize in a particular subject, for example myself, if you do model photography, once you photograph enough people, you will realize that certain lenses don't suit certain faces. You may not know this until you get to the client and you meet the person for the first time, so you cannot pre-plan this because you don't know what they look like.
This is particularly true if, like me, you search for models on Instagram. People are getting quite good at using filters on their photos, so what you see on Instagram and what you see when they knock on your front door can be two completely different things. So just to be aware, don't base your lens choice on what you see on Instagram. As a tip.
So a great example is if people have more pointy features, say a big nose like this, if you're trying to shoot with a 50mm lens or wider, the nose is going to come into the photo, and if you're shooting girls, as I do in my example, they may complain that their nose looks too big. You won't know this is a problem until you get to the shoot.
Obviously, if you know who you are photographing in advance, you can see what their facial features look like and plan accordingly. But if, like me, you're traveling and shooting, say, overseas, and you don't book some models until you get there, then in that case, it's good to have different focal lengths for different face shapes, different body shapes.
Or perhaps the second real world situation is the lens is too sharp for the person's skin. Again, if you've only got one lens with you and you're doing client work and they're paying you, if they hate every photo because they can see every pore and you're shooting your lens wide open, you would have benefited by having a second or third lens in your bag to give you options to make sure the client enjoys what you're giving them.
A quick hack, if you are only carrying one sharp super duper lens, is to use either a softening filter or even just to smear a bit of Vaseline on an old lens filter. It does the same trick. I did this with the Leica Summicron 75mm f2 Apo lens because it is very sharp. This is an extra tip. If you're working with older models with less perfect skin, some of the vintage lenses are really good for portraits. I think my 3 favourites are the Canon 50 1.4 LTM, Leica Summiter 50 f2 LTM, and Leica Summerit 50 1.5 M-mount.
A real world situation example, I was photographing a girl with a 35mm lens. They didn't like the pictures so much. I then tried a 50mm lens. They liked the photos a bit more. I then switched to the Leica Elmrit R 135mm f2.8 lens on the Leica SL, and suddenly they loved every photo. It's just finding the lens that gives the perspective to the model that they like the most. So if I had only brought, say, a 35mm lens to that model shoot, I would have had an unhappy client, and that may have resulted in lost work in the future. Okay, so with all that said, how can I add value to this video? I will cover 7 practical solutions to give you the benefits of one camera, one lens, however, give you a solution to minimize the problems. So solution number 1.
All that's coming up in the next video. Firstly, a big thank you to the over 1,100 of you who voted on my YouTube poll as to if you could only carry one lens, what would be your preferred focal length. The results are: in third place, 28mm with 12% of the votes. Second place, 35mm with 35% of the votes. And first place, a clear winner with almost half the votes, 45% of the votes. So I guess the question is to Leica, why don't you make a fixed lens 50mm camera? So something like a Q2, but with a 50mm fixed lens instead.
As always, a massive thank you to my awesome patrons, and see you in the next video. Bye.